Welcome to Santana True Crime. Tonight, we've got author Mark Pinsky joining us. Mark has a very long and storied career. He started out at Duke University. He's also volunteered with the Israeli Defense Force. He's worked for many major newspapers and reported in several countries. And he's covered everything from politics to religion to true crime. He also interviewed Jeffrey MacDonald and serial killer Ted Bundy. But one of his favorite accomplishments is that he actually helped my brother and I when we wrote our book, A Murder on Campus. So, Mark, thank you very much.
Thank you for having me, Cameron. I should say that I was a civilian volunteer attached to the Israeli army in Sinai in 1967.
Well, that's still quite a resume, and I didn't include your books on here, but we'll put those in as well.
That's fine. That's fine.
So, Mark, I want to start out with Ted Bundy just because it's so fascinating. And I'm sure you're probably one of the few people that have interviewed him. And I saw this quote on your website, which your website is markpinsky.com. It said, "Most killers are stupid, banal, and the opposite of charming. Bundy and McDonald are exceptions." Can you talk us through how did you become the interviewer for Ted Bundy?
Sure. It's a natural progression. I began writing about criminal justice in 1973 when I nationally broke a story about a woman named Joanne Little who had been accused of murdering her white jailer and escaping from jail in eastern North Carolina. And that set me off. I later covered her murder trial. She was later acquitted. But from that time in 1973, it launched me into writing about racial injustice and the disproportionate application of the death penalty for people of color. So all through the 70s, I wrote about cases from the Southeast, not all murder cases, not all capital cases, but they all involved racial injustice. Along the way, I met a death penalty specialist, a lawyer, a real pioneer in death penalty coverage. His name is Millard Farmer. He's passed away now. And we really got along. And then I kept writing my stories, which were basically about racial injustice, until toward the end of the 70s, I got a phone call from Millard. And he said, Mark, would you like to interview Ted Bundy? I said, well, Millard, it's not really my kind of story. You know, I do other kinds of stories, but it involves the death penalty, and sure, I'll do it. And I said, but how am I going to get in? How's that going to happen exactly? And he said, don't worry about it. He said, I'll meet you in Tallahassee, where Bundy was then being held, and I'll get you in. I said, what should I do? He said, well, wear a suit, carry an attaché case, and look white. And I assure you, you will get in to talk to him. So the first attempt failed because he couldn't make it and his assistant couldn't get me in. And I was ready to throw in the towel. And he said, no, I'll be there this time and I'll get you in. And sure enough, we just waltzed right through the jail in Tallahassee and went up to, I guess you would call it a suite exactly, but it was a separate area where there was a cell on one side of the bars and a kind of reception area on the other side of the bars. And Millard said, there's certain ground rules here. I don't want you to ask him about particulars of the case, but ask him anything else you want. And if there's a problem, I'll stop him or I'll stop you. I said, fine. So in all the 1970s, when I was covering these cases, all the people who were accused of murder and some who committed murders were different from me in some way. I'm a middle-class guy, white guy. And most of the people I dealt with were of a different race, sometimes a different gender, and a different class. And I could always sort of separate what they told me. Even when they told me they had committed this murder and why, I could separate myself from them. So I go into Bundy's cell area, and he's playing classical music on the public radio station. He's a handsome guy, as everybody knows, very soft-spoken, not crazy looking. And it struck me, if someone like this could commit what I thought he had committed, then someone like me could do that. And the walls of separation, the cognitive dissonance that you sometimes use with people different from yourself, just evaporated. And so I would have to say I was shaken by the first encounter when I sat down. He was very polite, and I began asking him questions, and he answered them, you know, without resistance, didn't dodge anything, but they were mostly about his personal life and his background. And throughout the interview, I got the feeling that the person that I was speaking with in the cell was not the person who had committed 20, 30, 35 murders. But somewhere tucked away in the cortex was the being that did those things. And it's not given a lot of publicity, but although on the eve of his execution, he claimed that he did what he did because of exposure to pornography as a young person. My investigation showed that he only killed when he was drunk. Of course, that doesn't raise the kind of cultural issues that are usually used. And so we had this discussion. Must have been about an hour and 15 minutes. At the end, I said, Ted, I was calling him Ted. He was calling me Mark. I said, Ted, when I publish this, no one's going to believe that I was here. He said, well, hand me your legal pad. And I handed him my legal pad through the bars. And where I had stopped taking notes, he wrote, Mark, thanks for interviewing me, Ted Bundy, and handed it back. Now, if I could find that legal pad today, I would be in an interesting situation. And as I predicted, when the first article appeared in a Slick magazine, then called New Times, the sheriff, Ken Katsaris in Tallahassee, insisted I had never been in there. But in fact, later it was proven that I was there. Then a number of other reporters tried to get in, and they let them be outside in the hallway and ask questions that way. But no one that I knew until that time had a lengthy face-to-face interview with Bundy. But it was, I would say, the strangest interview I've ever done in 55 years of journalism. It was just very, very creepy. And that's
so that blows me away that you were able just to walk, into a maximum security prison.
No, it was.
Well, you didn't have an appointment, right?
No, it was a county jail in Tennessee. He was not in. This was before the trial. This was shortly after he was captured. That I had this opportunity, and one of the reasons the sheriff was so antsy after my interview was published was that the week before, about 5 inmates of his jail had just walked away from the jail. So he was a county sheriff and his elected position, and I don't think he wanted 2 scandals in the space of 2 or 3 weeks. But so that was, I was surprised, but then it really reflected why Bundy had been so quote unquote successful in doing what he did. He was white. He was middle class. He was college educated. And he was able to get onto these college campuses and these campus bars, and no one suspected him because he was just like them. The kind of inherent racism that exists in this country. You suspect someone whose skin color is darker than yours, who's poorer than you, or more desperate than you. But he just looked like everybody else in the bar, everybody else on the college campus. And for the same reason that he was able to get into these various places and do what he did, I was able to get into the jail because no one thought that, another, ostensibly lawyer. I never said I was a lawyer. I never lied to get in. I don't do that. But they just assumed if I was with Millard Farmer, the chief attorney, waltz on in. They didn't ask for ID, anything. It's very strange.
So I also saw something strange that was in a cell. The rope.
Yeah.
You had that in the article that he had like a braided rope.
A braided rope that was made of strips of sheets.
And they just allowed him to have that?
Apparently so. I mean, I read enough and covered enough cases to know where people and inmates, in fact, had hanged themselves using just such a rope,
Right.
made
Yeah,
up of
that's a
sugar.
common thing.
Um, and there he was. He had this woven rope on his desk. It was just. I found it in the South, particularly. There's sometimes a very relaxed notion of law enforcement, not at all as strict as you might expect under the circumstances. So I couldn't believe it was happening when it was happening, and was I couldn't believe it when I left and I wrote the article and the article appeared. Um, but there have been other sort of strange things, not as strange, but similarly strange things. I had one case, I guess it was the Meadow on the Mountain case with Nancy Morgan, which we may talk about later, where a sheriff in Eastern Tennessee, I was trying to track down a key witness, and he was sort of in the wind, and then he was out of North Carolina, he was in Eastern Tennessee. And so I contacted the sheriff, was very helpful, and he said, oh yeah, he's around. I'll go pick him up for you. So, so I go to the sheriff's office, and this guy gets brought in from his house, no warrant, no nothing like that. And he said, okay, drive back with him, and I want you to be honest with him. That in a big city in the North, that would never happen, but it happened. And so I got the interview I was looking for. Sometimes, the lights are all green.
Well, I do want to talk about Nancy Morgan because that's an incredible case. And also the fact that you spent 40 years on it is just remarkable. But let's talk about Jeffrey MacDonald real quick,
Okay.
because I think that's another interesting point in your life, or at least I find it interesting. Can you tell us about what kind of involvement you had in that case? I understand that you attended the trial and you got to speak with him.
Yes, I covered the trial, but before that, which got me in the doghouse with him, is that I'd covered the investigation leading up to his trial. And I was living in Durham, North Carolina. I had finished Duke University. And when he gave his account of what happened, it just did not ring true to me. For one thing, I knew in those years, for the 70s, I probably knew most everybody who was doing dope in Fayetteville, Fort Bragg. And so I have friends of friends. And so I said, what about his story about the hippies invading his house and killing his pregnant wife and 2 girls? And it says, bullshit. Never happened. He had a reputation for playing with other women while he was there. And no one in Fayetteville knew him or knew these 3 or 4 people who are alleged to have broken into his quarters, chanting acid and groovy,
Kill the pigs.
Kill the pigs. And it was a phony from the beginning. And it had a very negative negative result, because as a result of that story, law enforcement people across North Carolina began breaking in on people and busting in people and just chasing what he said happened. And it just didn't happen. So I began writing for it. At that time, I was stringing freelancing for the New York Times. And I wrote a number of articles about him, about the case. I profiled his father-in-law, Alfred Kassab, who really carried the ball on getting him charged and tried. And by the time the trial started, MacDonald didn't like my coverage. He didn't like me. He would talk to me because I had a fairly good relationship with one of his lawyers, a man named Bernie Siegel from Philly. And he would answer questions, but only in a 1 or 2 word answer. He wouldn't let me come over and interview him. I asked, got turned down, but that's part of the deal. And I remember the couple days we were sitting in court just before the trial started, and I saw Freddie Kassab, the father-in-law, who played such a key role, sitting in the spectator section. And I sat down next to him, and he said, "Look over there at the defense table." He said, "Joe McGinnis is over there," and he said he sold his soul for $600,000 to prove that MacDonald is innocent. And I said, "Well, Freddie, McGinnis is going to sit in this courtroom with you and me, and he's going to listen to the evidence. And I wouldn't count him out in terms of his own ability to discern what happened and what didn't happen." And sure enough, When McGinnis wrote his book, Fatal Vision, he basically said MacDonald did it. And I was not surprised, just because, when lots of money is involved, you sometimes have an issue with how the book turns out. Joe McGinnis had, in fact, signed a contract that he was going to write a book. I don't know why he signed the contract, proving that MacDonald was innocent. And so when he wrote the book, MacDonald sued him, and there was a long trial and a settlement finally on what happened. But yeah, I mean, the guy, I'll tell you another story. I don't know if this is in McGinnis's book, but throughout the trial, MacDonald hadn't taken the stand. The scientific evidence came in, and all the other evidence came in. And when the defense was on, I learned this from Bernie Siegel, that MacDonald insisted that he take the witness stand. And Bernie said, don't do it. For a defendant in a case like this, don't take the witness stand. MacDonald insisted. He's the client, so he took the witness stand. And I believe until the time he took the witness stand, he was about to be acquitted. But he got on the witness stand, and this face of evil and arrogance came out, and I could see the jury turning. He was just so arrogant, and then it came out that he had bought flowers and lingerie for one of his girlfriends while his wife was in the hospital delivering one of their children. And even in North Carolina, it's not the death penalty if you do that, but it turned the jury, I'm convinced, because he was so arrogant and insisted on taking the witness stand.
So ultimately, that was the motive, that he had this girlfriend on the side, and he wanted a new life.
Well, the thought was, it wasn't just one woman. He had several women, and he was this handsome guy, doctor, Green Beret, and I don't think he wanted to be tied down to his family anymore. And I don't think he planned it exactly, but I think, as Joe McGinnis concluded, he had a psychotic episode. This was on his mind. If only he could be free. If only he could do this and that. And he just had a psychotic episode, maybe related to the drugs he was taking, the antidepressants he was taking. I don't know that. That was McGinnis's theory. It's plausible. But I just think he had this psychotic episode, and he thought of the kind of life he could lead if he wasn't burdened down by a family. Now, he could have left the family, rather than killing them. And I can always remember the opening statements of Jim Blackburn, the assistant U.S. attorney. He had a picture of the two girls who were for Halloween dressed up as little angels on a big easel in front of the jury. And he said to the jury, he said, frankly, he said, I can't convince you that this man was capable of killing his pregnant wife and two little girls. But I will show you through the forensic evidence that he did it. So you don't have to worry about whether he was capable of doing it. You'll just find that he did do it based on the forensic evidence. And that's what happened.
It's an incredible story. So we're going to jump now to Murder on the Mountain. It was, again, the book that we reached out to you for when we were trying to get some guidance with a murder on campus. You started this book when you were at Duke, correct?
Right. Although the Joanne Little case in 1973 was my first actual involvement in covering a case. In June of 1970, I was working. I was still an undergraduate, about to graduate from Duke University. I worked for the campus paper, the Chronicle, and I wrote a column called The Readable Radical, which reflected my politics of the time and still my politics today. And the students had been sent home because it was right after Kent State. And so I was up in the office of the Chronicle, and I opened the afternoon newspaper, the Durham Sun. And there was on the front page was a story about Nancy Morgan, Vista worker, kidnapped, raped, and murdered, body discovered. And I read the article. I opened it up to a full page on the inside. It talked about her life. And the more I read it, the more I thought she's kind of just like me and my friends. I mean, she was a sort of altruistic person trying to improve the world in some way. Many of her views reflected my own views. She opposed the Vietnam War, even though her dad was a career Air Force officer. She went through some of the same things some of my friends did while a student. And so I took a metal pica ruler, which some people may remember, may not, and cut out the article and opened a manila folder and put the article in there. And I just put Nancy Morgan on the file. I didn't know what would come of it. I just said, I have to follow this case. And so from 1970 on, I began collecting information, some of which came to me serendipitously. When I was trying to make a living, getting started as a journalist when I finished Duke, I was working for a professor at University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And she hired me to do interview prep notes for a project she was on. She was founding Jacqueline Hall. She was founding the Southern Oral History Project. And so my job was to go to the library. They had something called the Southern Collection. They had a huge collection of clip files about various figures in North Carolina politics. And the notion was I would do prep notes for the person who would do the interviews. And the interviews would be done with the condition that they would not be released while the subjects were alive. The notion being that under those circumstances, people would speak more freely and frankly than they would do if they thought it was going to be in the paper the next day. So I was going through these files, making these notes, and I opened a file which said Zeno Ponder. And it was about Zeno Ponder, the political boss of a small county up in Western North Carolina, and his brother, who was sheriff up there, and how they had this iron grip on this very poor county. And the county only had like 17,000 people in it. And so naturally, my conspiratorial thought was that they must have had something to do with a murder, which turned out not to be true, but that they would probably know who was involved in the murder. And that did prove to be true. It took a long time to get there, but that's where I got to. And so I would say I went to work for the Los Angeles Times after I finished at Duke. And I guess it would be around the late 80s or mid 80s. I began thinking that I want to do something bigger than just daily newspaper work. So I was friendly with the librarian at the Times, and she helped me gather material. This is all before the internet. Helped me gather material from around the country, from libraries and from newspaper morgues around the country, and everything went into the file. So the file was getting fatter and fatter, obviously, and then my time at the LA Times came to an end. And when I was looking around for where to go next, I decided I would try Central Florida because one of the central characters in the book I knew was there. I contacted him, but he brushed me off. He wasn't going to talk to me. But I took a job with the Orlando Sentinel. And once there, I would spend a week in the spring and a week in the fall up in Madison County, North Carolina, doing investigations. And I remember clearly saying, I feel like I'm in a movie. I mean, this is what happens on the screen. People don't really do this who aren't trained investigators. But I found a rhythm in that, and I did that for about 10 or 12 years, gaining more material until it got to be, I guess, 1994, when my brother, who's a very sharp guy, he's a politician in Maryland, he said, Mark, it's really time for you to write. You've been gathering material for 30, 35 years. And he says, it's time. I had no contract, so I had no deadline. So I took his advice and I wrote the manuscript, and it ended up with a small publisher in North Carolina. And the book was published in 2013. And even though the book was published and I did a lot of touring for the book, I still pegged to the case. I couldn't let it go. And as I watched what happened and what didn't happen, all the material that I came up with, including a confession from somebody I believe was involved in the killing, I could not convince law enforcement, either local or state, to seriously pursue where I was going. So, you do all you can, and then you're done. And then I would say 4 or 5 years ago, you might know this better than I, um, the concept of genetic genealogy
Right.
surfaced, and cases were getting solved left, right, and center because it's fairly simple. I mean, if you get access to databases and you have not a common name, um, it's it's like low hanging fruit. And I knew that there had been DNA samples taken at the time of the murder, and that at least when I was writing the book, those samples still existed in the state criminal lab in Chapel Hill. And so I thought, well, you know, why don't they use genetic genealogy if they can? And I could never get a straight answer out of the sheriff, out of the state bureau of investigation. And when we did a new edition in 2023, University of Kentucky did an updated edition of a trade paperback. I kind of stuck it to them in the epilogue of the book. Why won't they do that? And I still could never get a straight answer out of them. And I finally have concluded that either they lost the sample, or after all these years, the sample had degraded to the point where they couldn't make the connection, but they were not willing to cop to the fact that they had lost it or they had missed an opportunity.
And that doesn't surprise me. That actually happened in our case as well too, where they would say that, "Oh, we have DNA," but then when we would say, "Well, do you have DNA from semen?" And then they'd go, "Oh, we can't," and, talk about that.
Right. Right. So it's an ongoing investigation, so we can't tell you anything.
Right. But then we would hear on the side, and after the book came out, we had some people come forward as well, and they're like, "Yeah, they lost that, but we know by 1980 it had been lost." And the murder happened in 73. So they lost it a long time ago. And there's other cases, especially in North Carolina, that had that same issue. So there seems to be a trend in this.
Right. What happened was from the very beginning, from the day her body, Nancy Morgan's body, was discovered, it was really a very, very sloppy investigation. And even when the State Bureau of Investigation agreed to look into my evidence, they came to my house. They flew down from Raleigh. I was living in Orlando at that time. And they started asking me questions. I showed them what I had, and they weren't going to show me jack. They just, and I knew that, but I showed it. But they began asking me questions, and the line of the questioning was not who I thought did it, but anything that would incriminate the person who was charged and tried and acquitted. They were still trying to clean up after what happened and not show themselves to be incompetent. And so I thought, well, I should have known better, but I didn't. So you learn from experience.
Yeah, and that's so sad that someone lost their life, and because of decades of incompetence, this hasn't been solved. I thought that was another interesting aspect where, I mean, you got a confession in jail, and you take that confession to the SBI, and they just blow you off.
No, they said, well, we'll look into it, which is a
Right.
polite way of blowing you off.
Well, at
And they
least they
said, well,
provided.
they said they spoke to the person who gave me three confessions, once up in the mountains and twice at Central Prison in Raleigh. And they said, well, we don't find him convincing. We think he's just trying to gain attention. Now, this is a guy who was in prison for poisoning to death his 5-year-old daughter to get his wife back. And he's going to be in jail. He wasn't going anywhere. He was never going to get out. He's still in prison. I spoke with him about 6 months ago. I went over to see him about 6 months ago. And the fact that they said he was just trying to gain attention, that just didn't do it for me. I just think they didn't want to prove that they had gotten the wrong person the first time around.
And
So
with touch DNA being around, are they able to use that in her case, or were her clothes and the bindings, were they packaged, or do they even have them? I know they lost them in our case.
everything was lost.
Oh,
Everything was lost, including the nylon rope that bound her. It was in the basement in this building in Asheville, and the river flooded, and so all that's gone away. More incompetence along the way. The semen samples that they took were from her body. They were vaginal and anal swabs. They never took oral swabs, which they didn't realize until I asked them about it. And what they said it showed was there were multiple donors in the sperm samples that they found, which jibes with the story that this person, Richard Johnson, told me. So, I mean, I think my scenario, is much more plausible than the one that they stick to.
yeah, and people will have to get the book to get the details on this. We're not gonna go through the entire thing, but it's an extremely interesting case, and I hate those ones that, are solvable. And especially with today, and like you were saying with genealogy and now private labs, they need 16 cells to be able to create a profile. I mean, that's, a lot of those cases can be solved if evidence is packaged properly and not thrown away or lost. But let's jump now to your current project. So, doing a case in the 1970s has got to be difficult. And you decided to go to 1938.
Yes.
Can we talk
So,
about first about just to give some history and perspective on St. Simon Island?
yes, I mean, has a kind of storied history. Was pretty much isolated until the 1920s, when it was pretty much isolated until the 1920s, when Northern industrialists discovered it and began buying it up, and they wanted to develop it as a resort for wealthy people, for a winter resort for wealthy people from the north. And the the big move was when they had a causeway built between the mainland, Brunswick, Georgia, and St. Simon's Island, and that kind of uh, a man named Howard Coffin, who was involved in the Hudson Automobile project. He paved roads, he improved the land, he got things started there, and it was on the way to becoming a resort island, successful resort island, until 1929, when the crash came, and he lost most of his money and he lost his investment. The island didn't go away, but it didn't proceed at the rate that people would think it was. And on the island, there was the oldest church was called Christ Church Frederica. It was founded before the United States was founded, actually, founded by the Wesley brothers, who later helped found the Methodist Church in England and in the U.S. And they had a rector there, whose name was the Reverend Charles Lee, very charismatic speaker, physically imposing man, uh, second cousin to Robert E. Lee. And he had this habit of denouncing vice generally from the pulpit, but not individuals. His reputation was he would go to individuals in private if he had a problem with their conduct. And in the weeks and months preceding Reverend Lee's death, he had been campaigning against quote unquote vice, which people took to mean slot machines, alcohol, because Georgia still had prohibition then, alcohol and prostitution. And on the night of February 5th, 1938, he was in the rectory making notes for his sermon when from the yard he was shot in the head and killed. And Suspicion immediately fell on two white brothers who were thought to have controlled the rackets on St. Simon's Island. And they were indicted. But also indicted was a semi-literate black janitor who'd worked for them. And he was alleged to have been the trigger man on very tissue-thin evidence. And in the end, the black janitor was convicted. The white brothers were never tried. And two red flags, when someone told me the story, tipped me to the story, two things struck me right away. Number one, here's a black man accused of killing a very prominent white man. And in southern Georgia in the 1930s, he wasn't lynched. So that's one red flag. That doesn't really jive. And the second one, he was tried and convicted of first-degree murder, but the all-white jury recommended mercy. And that's a bigger red flag. That just does not compute. Something was going on behind the scenes. So he wasn't executed. However, he spent 23 years on a chain gang in Georgia, which was no picnic, and finally was released as an old man and had a few years of freedom and then died. Now, I came on the case because totally serendipitously. I exercised at a Duke Fitness Center here in Durham, and I was with my trainer, and he said, "Oh, there's John Martin out on the track, indoor track." He said, "He's an interesting guy. You should talk to him." So I said, "Okay." So I finished my workout. I went on the track and I said, "Hi." I introduced myself, and he introduced himself. And I said, "Well, what do you do?" He says, "I'm a history professor at Duke, medieval history at Duke." And he said, "What do you do?" I said, "Well, I write about racial injustice and the death penalty in the South." He said, "I may have a story for you." Now, over 50 years, I've heard that more times than I can count, and it never works out. There's something wrong with the case at some point where I said, "But I'll listen." And that's when he told me the story. His father had been a rector at the same church decades after the murder, had written a parish history, and in the parish history was a chapter on the murder of the previous rector. And he said, "There's this guy who lives down there. He's not a professional, but he just got interested in the case about 20 years ago, and he's been collecting all this material to show that the black guy didn't do it. But he has cancer, and he's afraid he'll die, and the case will go away." He said, "Would you be willing to take it on?" And I said, "Well, I would work with a collaborator." I said, "But how about this? I don't want to jump in any direction. Why don't you send him my two books, my two true crime books, including Meadow on the Mountain, and my friend's book about historical true crime involving race." I said, "Send," this guy's name is Rick McBride, "send Rick these books and ask him if he thinks, having looked at them or read them, if we're the guys he wants to do the job." And about a month later, I saw John again, and he said, "Rick wants to work with you." And that began a process probably 2 years ago of him sending me all these documents that he had, legal documents, newspaper articles, stuff from the 1930s, you could never get today. It's just impossible. And it took me about 6 months to go through it. And we decided that we could do this project. And so we began doing interviews and going through the material. And that has brought us to where we are today. We believe, I should say this, we believe that we conclusively prove that George Claiborne, the black janitor, was not responsible for the murder. And we believe we conclusively proved that through this cache of documents that were given to us, that he didn't do it. What we don't have at this point yet is a strong sense of who really did do it. Now, in murder trials, jurors and people who read or listen to true crime are apt to say, "Well, okay, you convinced me that your guy didn't do it. So who did do it? Well, you're not obligated as a lawyer or prosecutor or as a journalist to come forth with a clear scenario. I mean, it's not like TV where you get flashbacks. You know exactly what happened. And so it's harder for us to come up with what I call an act 3 of who did do it. Now we will try to do that, but we're hoping that the credibility that we may have gained in the first part of what we wrote will give readers a chance to go with us on a speculative scenario about what really happened. We don't have the proof, not yet anyway. We've made several trips to St. Simon's. Our last trip was a panel. My co-author, Steve Hoppius, myself, and Rick McBride came up. We had a panel on St. Simon's Island on a weekday morning, and 200 people showed up. And my thought in planning the event was that we would tell them what we knew in hopes that someone in the audience would know something else that would bring us to, that would shake the tree. So far, it hasn't happened, but one person has helped us setting up an interview with someone who's very old, but will speak with us. So we're going to go back to St. Simon's the end of May and interview her and see if we have anybody else to interview. But right now we have a long magazine manuscript. It's about 20,000 words that we hope to place in a prestigious magazine that can handle articles that big, that long, and hope that if and when that article appears, it may also shake loose some more information or attract the interest of a commercial publisher that would enable us, would give us the time and the money to go back and dig deeper and deeper and deeper in terms of who really did it. You there? I think you're frozen. Cameron? Is there an engineer still listening who can help us? Oh, I see some movement, Cameron. Let me know when you can hear me again.
Did I pop back right at the ending?
I hear you. Cameron's still frozen on my screen.
Oh, his internet might be having an issue.
Okay.
what we can do is we can edit where the ending point is, so we'll be able to pick it back up and edit this together. So you'll be able to edit me out.
So, are you still recording me?
Yes, it's still recording right now.
Okay, good, very good. So we didn't lose anything.
No.
So are we waiting to see if he can get back up?
Yeah, I just texted him to see if he can, what his plans are.
Yeah, because I just texted him and told him he was still frozen on my screen.
I'm not sure if that part of the country is getting weather tonight or not. I live in Colorado.
And he's in West Virginia? No.
North Carolina, I believe.
Yes, okay. Okay, I just got a text from him saying, hold on.
Yep, he said I'm frozen. I'm going to have him leave the studio and then try to have him come back.
Okay.
Here he goes. About the 45-minute mark. He's going to try to restart his computer real quick. He said it was still frozen for him.
Okay. I'm in a hurry. I'm available.
Okay. Yeah. Same thing. I'm just relaxed. I have a company that I design mounts and parts for emergency lights. So all the lights and stuff that go in, like police cars and fire trucks and stuff like that.
Right.
We make them because like for Explorers, all like the regular cars they make stuff for, but for like the non-traditional vehicles, no one makes anything for. So we can go in and 3D scan it, and then we can 3D model it, and then we have a fleet of 3D printers that we print all of our little components off. So I've got an expo coming up in a couple weeks that I'm just prepping for.
Good.
And the connect is Mike and Cam.
Where in Colorado are you?
I live just off the Front Range, just in Loveland, just east of 25, if you're familiar with the area.
How far is that from Boulder?
About we're northeast, maybe 45 minutes.
Because my last book takes place in Boulder.
It's pretty, but it's expensive. It's very expensive.
People were then moving to Lewis or Lewiston or Louisville, which was right near, and then they were getting priced out of that place too.
Yeah. We got lucky where we're at now. We're not in a gated community, but it almost feels gated because there's one entrance on one side and one entrance on the other side, and it's just these two little communities on this plateau.
Mm. Mm.
Looks like it's trying.
Yeah, right. See that. He said he was going to restart his computer. I see a face, but no movement. Or do I see movement? No.
Yep.
Gone.
I'll be back. I lived in Hawaii before here, so
Really?
I was already used to expensive.
Yeah. I was there for the first time. It's the tail end of COVID. My daughter and her partner lived in Australia, and so we met in Hawaii.
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
But I think the difference between Hawaii and Colorado is Colorado is kind of like the Grand Canyon. If I take a picture of Hawaii and you go to Hawaii, you can kind of grasp that picture from seeing the picture. But you can't grasp the Grand Canyon in a picture. You can't grasp mountains and like the size of things, and it's incredible.
There you go.
All right, I'm back.
Hey,
All right. Good gosh.
All right. So what I'll do is you guys can chit chat to kind of figure out where we're back, and then just clap or make like some gesture. That way we know when to edit it back out. And I've already made some notes about where the issue started. So no worries. We'll edit this out. It's not a big deal.
Yeah, I think I'm gonna probably have to like clean out my computer. I don't know if that's why, if it's a like a memory thing or what's going on.
Yep. I'll work with you after, and then we'll troubleshoot it. That way, if we can see if it's something that we can fix, or if it's something that just, because sometimes things just happen.
Gotcha.
Uh,
Okay,
if you
well,
need to
Mark, I'm
redo-
sorry about that.
if you need to redo or fill in, I'm generally available on short notice.
Okay. Well, I appreciate that. So I know that you were talking about how you were telling the story about how you were at the gym, and Deadleg, were you listening to this? Was it picking up on his end?
No, I had just started to wrap up what I was doing on the other thing and coming back over, and you were just getting frozen. So I was like, "Oh, that you guys were just finishing up," and he said, "No, that you were frozen."
Okay, I'm gonna clap, and if you could just start when you were at the Duke gym, and then we'll make a note and go from there. Is that
Okay.
good? All right.
Good.
Ready? 3, 2, 1.
I stumbled onto the story really serendipitously. I was working out at the Duke Fitness Center. I live in Durham, and I had a trainer, and he said, "There's a guy out on the track you might find interesting. He's another one of my clients." I said, "Fine." So I finished up. I walked up to him. I introduced myself, and I said, "What do you do?" And he said, "I'm a professor of medieval history at Duke." And he said, "What do you do?" And I said, "Well, I write about racial injustice and the death penalty." And he said, "I might have a story for you." Now, over the years, I can't tell you how many times I've heard that, and it's never worked out. One reason or another, it never worked out. But I said, "Okay, I'll listen." We walked around the track, and he said, "My father was a rector at a church on St. Simon's Island where a murder took place in the late 1930s. My father was rector there, the pastor, several decades later, and he was working on a parish history, and he wrote a chapter about this murder that took place. And it took place in the house that this professor grew up in. He and his brother grew up in this house that had bullet holes in the wall. And he said, on the evening of February 5th, 1938, the Reverend Charles Lee, a very prominent and powerful speaker, was working on notes for his Sunday sermon, and someone from the yard shot him in the head and killed him. And Reverend Lee was, he drew many people to his sermons, including people like Henry Ford and Calvin Coolidge. He was that kind of a preacher. And he had this habit of denouncing bad things in general from the pulpit. But if he had a problem with an individual, he would go to see that individual privately to talk about it. And so immediately suspicion fell on two white brothers who were thought to control the rackets on St. Simon's, including slot machine gambling, alcohol. It was still in Georgia, there was still prohibition, and prostitution. And so immediately suspicion fell on these two white brothers. But as it happened, one of their part-time employees, a semi-literate black man, a janitor named George Claiborne, was also accused. And in the end, Claiborne was tried for the murder. The two white brothers were never tried. And two things about the story that John Martin told me on the track that day aroused my interest. Number one, the fact that in South Georgia in the 1930s, a black man was accused of killing a white, prominent white man and was not lynched, number one. Number two, that's a red flag. Number two, he was tried, George Claiborne was tried for the murder and convicted of first-degree murder. But the all-white jury came back with a recommendation for mercy. But the all-white jury came back with a recommendation for mercy rather than the death penalty. And that's really a red flag. That just doesn't compute. And so the George Claiborne served 23 years on Georgia chain gangs, which was no picnic, as you might expect, was paroled in his later years, survived for 2 or 3 years, and then he died. And the case kind of always hung over St. Simon's Island because it just didn't seem rational the way that it came out. And so John Martin, this Duke professor, said that his father had written a chapter about this murder, but that there was a man in St. Simon's whose wife was a member of the congregation who was a true crime buff. And he got interested in the case, and he began gathering material, transcripts, police reports, autopsy reports, and then began collecting contemporaneous news accounts of the case, of the trial, of which there were hundreds. And he had all this material, but he's not a writer, and he had cancer, and he was afraid that he would die before anyone could tell the story. So John Martin said, would you be willing to take this on? I said, well, why don't we do this? I'll give you copies of my last 2 true crime books and a book co-written by my collaborator on a historic true crime book, and send it to this person named Rick McBride. And if he thinks we're the right people to do it, we'll do it. And about a month later, Rick said, he's going to start to send you files. And there were boxes and boxes of files. But it was a cache of stuff that you couldn't imagine getting on your own. It just was, a gold mine of material. And that's how we began working on the book. And we made several site visits. The last site visit we made was a panel. My co-author, Steve Hoffius, myself, and Rick McBride, the person who led us to the case. And we did a panel sponsored by the Literary Guild of St. Simon's Island on a Tuesday or Wednesday morning, and we drew 200 people. And our thought was we would tell them what we knew so far in hopes of shaking loose some memories or some rumors of what really happened. In the beginning, it didn't happen. We've had a couple nibbles, and so we're going to be going back to St. Simon's the end of May to do some more interviews. We have about 20,000 words written in hopes of placing it in a magazine that would then attract attention by a commercial book publisher, and we would be able to really dig in even more than we already have.
That's a really interesting perspective that you had with the person that was charged, of how he wasn't lynched. So, and he was given mercy. And I completely agree with you that seems to be a really big telling sign. So I assume that whole island is very just secretive, and this was just kind of everyone knew what really happened, but no one wanted to come out and talk type of
That was our
situation.
thought. Now, basically, the island is divided in kind of two in terms of demography. The old timers, the originals, have had this long-standing feeling about the case that was never solved, and they had their own ideas. And then St. Simon has become a very popular resort area, and a lot of people have moved there from around the country who knew nothing about this case, but maybe heard a little bit about it. And then when we had our panel, that's why I think so many people showed up. I think the audience was divided between old people who knew things and newer residents who were just curious about the case, had heard about it in one way or another.
Yeah, I thought that was an interesting approach too, and just you want to see how challenging this is, where you're handing out business cards to these older people in hopes that, maybe they knew someone who had some information, right? I mean,
Yes.
so you're
Because
relying on these older people as your information source.
yeah. Now, what had happened was that the case still hangs heavy on the old timers, and we felt that while they might not come forward at our meeting, at our panel, if we distributed business cards, they might contact us later. And we've had one bite so far of a newcomer who opened the door to an old timer, which is why we're going back in late May to interview this woman and some other people as well. So it's odd that a case that old, I mean, it's almost 90 years ago, and people are still reluctant to talk about it. And that's because, in part, the two White brothers were two of 8 siblings who became very successful after the murder. And they have a lot of descendants. And so some of them are intimidated about looking into what happened and the chance that it might, in fact, have involved their great-grandparents. So there was some reluctance, one, to hold the meeting and to sponsor the meeting. The library and the literary guild sponsored it. And so that's why we use the idea of handing out business cards. So we still hope, and if it becomes a magazine article, that may shake the tree some more. Maybe that'll shake some more things loose. It's hard to tell with these old things. So everybody who knows for sure is dead. And most of the children of those people who knew stuff are dead. So what we're looking at now is grandchildren and great-grandchildren. So it's obviously hearsay and rumor, but at this point in our investigation, we'll take that. I mean, we'll listen and see what to us sounds plausible as a scenario for who was responsible.
So is the ultimate goal in this, besides being able to get a book deal or get it into a major magazine publishing company, I assume this is really about giving this gentleman that was accused, the proper justice of, and be able to name an actual accuser.
Our goal is to obtain for George Claiborne a posthumous pardon of innocence from the state of Georgia. And we feel like if we can make a strong enough case, that will shake loose some support in South Georgia, and maybe we can make that happen. That's our goal.
That's a very noble task, and wish you the best on it. Hopefully when you come back, or when you get done with the article, you'll send it over to us. We'd love to put it out for you and give you some press on it.
Right.
But Mark, thank you.
Where are you located?
I'm in Raleigh. So yeah, we're just down the road from each other.
Okay. All right. Good. Very good.
But I know we were talking earlier, and my brother, who, for those who are listening, I did the book with, he's actually about to move down to now teach at UNC Wilmington.
Great.
So yeah.
That's a great town, Wilmington, now.
So he's going to start helping with the podcast some, and we've been talking about what case to tackle next as well.
Great. Okay.
Well, Mark, thank you so much. We can find you at markpinsky.com. Do you have anything else you'd like to plug?
No.
I know you've got several books. We'll put some links to them on the podcast. They can check that out. And also, if you follow Santana True Crime on IG, I'll put some stuff on there. That way you'll have some Mark's articles. He also did an article on this case on The Hill, which we'll put that up for you as well.
Right. And I did a blog item also on the actual meeting in St. Simon's.
Yes. We'll put all of that up for you. Again, thank you, Mark, and have a good night.
Cameron, thanks for having me. I appreciate you navigating through the technical difficulties.
Yeah, I'll figure this out. I'm so sorry about that.